Betrayed at the altar, I vanished into my grandmother's forgotten playhouse. 10 months later, my entire world had transformed. The dawn of my wedding painted itself like a masterpiece across the sky. One of those soft, luminous mornings that whispers promises of perfect days ahead. Golden light cascaded through towering windows of the bridal chamber, dancing across delicate lace and flowing silk draped on every chair. The atmosphere held hints of jasmine and warm honey candles my bridesmaids had arranged, while gentle conversations flowed as people drifted through, carrying crystal flutes, arranging blooms, and scrolling their devices. My cousin Sarah commanded that graceful chaos. As my matron of honor, she wore confidence like jewelry, gliding effortlessly between the stylist, bridesmaids, and myself, smoothing my train 1 second, offering champagne sips the next. Her dusty pink dress hugged her frame flawlessly, the fabric shimmering with each graceful turn. Her smiles came easily, perhaps suspiciously so, and I noticed her sharing glances with others nearby, looks that vanished abruptly whenever I faced their direction. I dismissed it as pre-ceremony jitters. Wedding mornings always make people act strangely, I reasoned. But sitting before that mirror, watching her reflection as she fussed with my veil, something flickered in her expression. Not joy, not affection, but something colder, more calculated. The garden ceremony site took my breath away. Pristine ivory chairs flanked a petal-strewn walkway. Climbing roses adorned wooden arches. Dappled sunlight filtered through overhead, branches like scattered diamonds. My stepfather offered his arm at the aisle's beginning, his face serene yet unreadable. We started our slow procession toward the altar, string music wrapping around us, floral perfume thick in the humid air. Michael waited there, his tuxedo impeccably tailored, his tie matching the azure sky. But when our gazes connected, his eyes couldn't hold mine. They darted away immediately, not toward the officiant, not toward our guests, but toward Sarah positioned just behind my left shoulder. That's when I caught Ida whisper from the front row. "She has no clue," followed by someone's urgent shushing. Moments later, another voice from somewhere behind. "It's been happening for months." The words were hushed, but they rippled through the crowd like electricity. Though I wanted to deny them, my body had already frozen. I continued walking, my grip tightening on my stepfather's arm, my pulse thundering so loudly it nearly drowned the music. My focus remained locked on Michael. The expression he gave me wasn't exactly guilt. It was something far worse. It was acceptance of the inevitable. When I reached the altar, the minister smiled and opened his book, but his words became meaningless noise. My voice emerged before rational thought could stop it, clear, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Michael," I said, my gaze burning into his, "I need you to answer me right now, in front of everyone. Is what they're saying true?" The atmosphere shifted instantly. Guest murmurs dissolving into silence so complete I could hear roses rustling in the breeze. Sarah's stare scorched the side of my face, but I refused to acknowledge her. Michael's jaw clenched. He glanced toward her for a heartbeat, then back at me. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "It's true." Rippled through the assembly. My stepfather gasped sharply beside me. Sarah didn't speak, didn't attempt denial. She simply straightened, lifting her chin slightly as though challenging anyone to confront her. I spoke no other words. I handed my bouquet to the officiant because I couldn't bear Sarah touching it, then turned away. My stepfather fell into step beside me without question, his arm still supporting me as we walked back down the aisle, past rows of stunned expressions. The music had ceased. Someone shouted my name, but I didn't turn back. The garden's side entrance led to a quiet pathway curving toward the street. My heels clicked against the cobblestones, my dress train gathering dirt. I didn't know my destination yet, only that I couldn't return home, couldn't endure endless retellings of this moment. Halfway down the road, I remembered the brass key tucked in my overnight bag's pocket. The one my late grandmother had given me years earlier, telling me it was for the day you need a door only you can open. Standing there in my wedding gown, I knew exactly where I belonged. The playhouse sat at a quiet street's end, its exterior weathered but dignified. Faded golden letters above the entrance barely visible in twilight's glow. The brass key felt cool in my palm, its edges rough from years of disuse. When it slid into the lock, resistance met me, as if the door had forgotten its purpose. Hinges protested as I pushed, releasing a wave of cool, dust-scented air, not unpleasant, but carrying that distinctive smell of long abandonment. The overnight bag I clutched was the only item untouched by today's disaster. I'd packed it 3 nights prior, following my grandmother Elena's advice to always have an escape route even for celebrations. It had seemed ridiculous than just fresh clothes, basic necessities, and a few personal treasures in case our hotel felt too overwhelming. But leaving the wedding, I'd walked to the small rental car I'd parked on a side street, a precaution against limousine confusion, and there it waited in the trunk like it had anticipated my need. Now it rested in my hands as I crossed the playhouse threshold, its weight strangely reassuring. Inside, the foyer maintained its grandeur despite neglect. Marble floors wore a delicate dust veil. The overhead chandelier hung motionless, its crystal teardrops catching faint glimmers from exterior streetlights. The ticket window still occupied one corner, its glass clouded and spotted, reflecting a ghostly image of me in my gown. Beyond the foyer doors, the theater itself waited rows of burgundy velvet seats, disappearing into darkness. Heavy curtains drawn partway across the stage like lips mid-word. I didn't explore extensively yet. I placed the bag in the small office, adjoining the foyer, the one my grandmother had occupied, and settled into the creaking chair, letting stillness penetrate my being. The weddings noised the crowd the moment Michael looked at me and said yes, all seemed suspended somewhere, distant, muffled by these thick walls. But I couldn't remain inside indefinitely. I needed sustenance and something as basic as a phone charger. After slipping off my heels and pulling on the flats I'd packed, I locked the playhouse behind me and stepped back into the evening air. The neighborhood felt suspended between decay and renewal. Some storefronts stood shuttered, their painted signs fading, while others glowed invitingly. A bakery with windows fogged from fresh bread, a small bookshop where someone arranged paperbacks in the display. A corner bistro spilling jazz into the night air. I approached the bistro first. Inside, coffee and cinnamon scents enveloped me. And behind the counter stood a man in his 50s with silver threading his hair and the kind of welcoming smile suggesting he'd been greeting strangers his entire life. His name was Vincent. When I mentioned the playhouse, his eyes brightened. "Your grandmother's place?" he asked. When I nodded, his voice gentled. She kept that venue alive longer than anyone believed possible. A determined, remarkable woman. I ordered the cheapest sandwich and tea, but when I reached for my wallet, he waved me away. "First night's complimentary," he said, then noticed my dress. "Looks like you've endured quite an ordeal." "It's fine to my return." I passed a man seated on the curb with a guitar case open beside him. His name was Jesse. I learned it immediately because he introduced himself like we were old friends, telling me he used to perform in the playhouse foyer between shows. "Best acoustics in the state," he said, patting his guitar. "You ever reopen it, you call me." By the time I returned to the playhouse, a paper bag of food in one hand and the faint warmth of human kindness in the other, the building no longer felt so hollow. I ate in the office, under the desk lamp's pool of light, the rest of the room in shadow, and for the first time since leaving the wedding, felt something approaching peace. Morning light entered the playhouse gently, sliding through tall front windows and spilling across marble floors in thin golden ribbons. I awakened in the office to faint city sounds outside a delivery truck idling somewhere nearby, The soft rattle of a shop's metal gate rising, a distant dog barking. The interior air was cool and still, holding the faint scent of dust mixed with the lavender bundle Maria had pressed into my hands at the market the day before. After a quick wash, in the tiny bathroom off the foyer, I made my way into the main hall. The burgundy velvet seats sat in neat rows, the aisle carpet worn but not threadbare, the curtains drawn halfway so the stage was caught between shadow and light. My grandmother had told me once that every theater had its own kind of silence. Some heavy, some restless, and this one felt almost curious, like it was watching to see what I would do. I started with the doors behind the stage. Most opened into dressing rooms lined with long mirrors doled at the edges, counters littered with remnants of another era. Stray bobby pins, a cracked powder compact, a perfume bottle with only a trace of fragrance remaining. One dressing room was different. Its mirror was spotless. The table empty except for a folded sheet of paper. My name was written on it in my grandmother's flowing script. Inside was a note. If you ever find yourself here, remember that this building was never just mine. Look for the people who can bring it alive again. They'll find you if you keep the doors open. I read it twice, tracing the paper's edges, feeling the words, wait. Later that morning, I stepped out into the street to see the neighborhood in daylight. Vincent waved from behind the bistro counter, holding up a small paper bag. For later, he called. Inside were 2 warm rolls and a small jar of jam. I thanked him and walked toward the market, which was busier than before. Stalls crowded with bright vegetables, buckets of flowers overflowing, racks of secondhand books and vintage records. Maria spotted me almost instantly. "You're the granddaughter," she said, as if we were continuing a conversation we'd already started. She handed me a bundle of mint and chamomile, telling me it was good for sleep. When I asked how she'd known my grandmother, her face softened. "She bought flowers from me every week," she said. "Even when there was no money for shows, there was always money for flowers." On the way back, I saw Jesse playing on the corner. A small group gathered around him. Between songs, he told me he had found an old set list from one of his performances in the playhouse. "We could bring it back," he said with a grin. "The music, the people, you'd see the whole place would wake up." At the time I stepped back into the playhouse, my hands full of bread, herbs, and a borrowed book from the market, the building didn't feel quite so foreign. The note in the dressing room stayed in my pocket, a small anchor to something I couldn't yet define. I didn't know how I would keep the doors open or what exactly that meant. But it was the first time since the wedding that my thoughts moved towards something other than the look on Michael's face, or the sharp, unflinching gaze of Sarah as he spoke the truth aloud. Here in this quiet stretch of street, with strangers who remembered my grandmother's name, there was the faint, steady pull of possibility. The first time I heard the knock on the playhouse's heavy doors, I almost didn't answer. It echoed strangely through the foyer, deep and hollow, like someone knocking on the ribs of the building itself. I'd been upstairs in the balcony, brushing away years of dust from the carved wooden rail, my mind far away. And the sound startled me enough that I froze before making my way down. When I opened the door, the woman standing there smiled with a mixture of warmth and determination. "I'm Sophia," she said, her voice carrying a faint accent. "I used to dance here. Your grandmother gave me my first real stage." She glanced past me into the foyer, her eyes catching on the chandelier, the tall windows, the deep shadows. "Vincent told me the doors were open again." She stepped inside without hesitation, moving through the foyer like someone reacquainting themselves with a beloved friend. Her fingertips trailed along the ticket booth's edge. And when she entered the theater itself, she stood for a long moment in the center aisle, just looking. "It's smaller than I remember," she said softly, "but it's still beautiful." We sat on the edge of the stage, and she told me stories about the last show she danced here, how the curtains had stuck halfway during the final act, how my grandmother had walked out in front of the crowd, making them laugh until the problem was fixed. She believed the stage was for everyone, Sophia said, looking at me like she was hoping I might too. That was when the idea came. Not a grand reopening, just a small gathering. The night of music and movement to see what it felt like to hear this place alive again. Jessie was eager the moment I mentioned it. Vincent offered to bring trays of food from the bistro. Even Maria promised she'd come, bringing tea and flowers. We set it for a Thursday. I spent the days leading up to it in constant motion, sweeping the balcony, polishing the brass door handles until they caught the light, airing out the dressing rooms. Sophia came to rehearse, her movements on the stage so fluid that I could almost see the audience she must have imagined in her mind. Jesse practiced in a quiet corner, his guitar notes spilling like warm water into the empty rows. By the time the evening came, the air was charged with a strange mix of nerves and anticipation. Maria arrived first, her arms full of flowers, their scent immediately softening the air. Vincent came next, balancing trays of pastries and thermoses of coffee. Jesse followed with his guitar and two friends, a violinist and a drummer, who carried their instruments like old companions. People trickled in, some curious, some who had clearly been here in better days, until the front rows began to fill. The music began and the playhouse changed. Jesse's warm, earthy guitar blended with the violin's lilting voice, the drum heartbeat beneath it all. Sophia danced next, the spotlight catching the sweep of her arms, her shadow painting graceful arcs across the heavy curtains. Between sets, people murmured to each other, sharing stories of plays they'd seen here, actors they'd met, nights my grandmother had somehow turned disasters into moments of magic. And then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen and felt my chest tighten. Mom, I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me knew this call wasn't casual. I slipped out into the foyer away from the warm glow of the stage and answered. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. I should have told you, she began, skipping any greeting. I knew about Sarah and Michael. I knew before the wedding, and I thought you'd see it for yourself. I thought if I told you, you wouldn't believe me, or you'd think I was trying to ruin it. She paused, and I could hear the faint clink of glass in the background voices. Somewhere far behind her, I was wrong. I'm sorry. The apology landed somewhere between a confession and a wound reopening. I stood there with the flowers Maria had brought, filling the air with sweetness. The music from the stage faint in the background, and thought about the silence my mother had chosen over telling me the truth. You could have saved me from finding out like that, I said finally, my voice quieter than I expected. I know, she whispered, but I didn't, and I'm sorry. We said nothing else before the line went dead. I slipped back into the theater just as Sophia was finishing her last turn on stage, her arms wide, her breath visible in the warm light. The crowd applauded, and I stood at the back, watching the way they leaned toward the stage, already asking when it would happen again. But the conversation in the foyer stayed with me. My mother's words didn't undo the betrayal or erase the moment in the garden, but they shifted something. A reminder that even truths that come late can still cut deep. When the night ended, I locked the doors behind the last guest. The playhouse was warm, the air still trembling faintly with the echo of music and voices. But somewhere beyond this street, the past had stirred, and I knew it wasn't done with me yet. 10 months changed the playhouse from a forgotten shell into a place that seemed to breathe on its own. The floors gleamed now, the curtains hung straight. The scent of flowers and wood polish lingered in the air, even on quiet days. What began as one small gathering had become a steady rhythm. Thursday evenings filled with music, dance, readings, and the hum of conversations spilling out into the foyer. Sophia taught morning movement classes. Jesse hosted open mic nights and Vincent's Bistro had a steady stream of customers who stopped in after a show. Even Maria started selling tea blends she named after different corners of the playhouse. I found myself at the center of it all without meaning to. One people came to for decisions. 4 keys, 4 stories about my grandmother. Somewhere in that stretch of months, the grief and humiliation I'd carried from the wedding began to loosen its grip. The playhouse gave me more than a hiding place. It gave me proof that endings could be rebuilt into something entirely new. The night it all came together, we'd planned something bigger than usual, a community showcase with music, dance, and even a short play from a local troupe. The seats filled early, and the air in the foyer before the show buzzed with the kind of energy that made the building feel almost alive. I was behind the ticket table when the door opened, and for a moment, I thought the light from outside had played a trick on me. My mother stood there, a step inside the threshold, her coat draped over one arm. My stepfather was beside her, his expression unreadable, and behind them, as if trying to stay at a distance, stood Michael. Even from across the foyer, I saw the way his gaze swept the space, the polished floors, the chandelier, the people filling the seats, and the faint, weary shift in his posture when our eyes met. They approached slowly, and I stayed where I was, the ticket table between us. My mother spoke first. "I've been hearing about this place for months," she said. "I had to see it for myself." She glanced toward the stage doors where music was starting to warm up. "It's impressive." Her voice held a kind of restraint, but it wasn't the dismissal I'd grown used to. My stepfather nodded once as if in agreement, though he said nothing. Michael shifted beside them, clearly wanting to speak. But the music from the stage swelled, calling everyone's attention. I stepped aside and gestured toward the main hall. "The show is starting," I said, keeping my voice even. They found seats near the back, and I took my place by the side of the stage, watching as the lights came up and the first notes filled the air. The performance unfolded beautifully. Jesse's guitar weaving with the violin, Sophia's movements, catching every beat of the music, the small play earning soft laughter and applause. I could feel the pride building in my chest with every moment of warmth that had nothing to do with them being there. When it was over, the audience rose in. Applause, the sound rolling through the hall like a wave. People spilled back into the foyer, talking excitedly, making plans to come again. My mother approached once more, and this time she didn't look around the room before speaking. "You've made something here," she said simply. "It's yours." Michael didn't speak at all. He met my eyes for a moment, but whatever words, he had never made it past his lips. My stepfather shook my hand, and then they left together, their figures swallowed by the night beyond the doors. I locked up after the last. Guests were gone, the playhouse quiet again, except for the soft settling of the old wood. Standing in the center of the stage, I looked out at the rows of empty seats, remembering the day I had arrived here in my wedding dress with nothing but a bag and a key. 10 months ago, I'd walked away from the life I thought I needed. I stood in the middle of the one I'd built for myself. The past had found me, but it didn't own me anymore. Spring arrived early that year, the kind of season where the air carried both the cool memory of winter and the gentle promise of warmth. The street outside the playhouse smelled faintly of rain on stone and the blossoms from the market stalls. A block away, on the morning of my wedding, my real wedding, the sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the foyer, spilling in golden shapes across the marble floor. Maria had filled the place with flowers, not arranged stiffly in vases, but scattered in ways that made them look like they'd grown here, as if the building itself had bloomed for the occasion. We didn't choose a garden or a hotel ballroom. We married here on the stage that had carried me through every step of the last 10 months. The burgundy velvet curtains framed the space like a painting. Sophia had strung lights across the rafters, so they glowed softly overhead, and Jesse sat with his guitar at the edge of the stage, cute, playing low and warm as people found their seats. Vincent stood at the back, handing out coffee and pastries instead of champagne, smiling at every guest as though this were his wedding too. When I stepped into the aisle, not between rows of white chairs this time, but between the deep burgundy, velvet seats of the playhouse, every step felt like it belonged to me. And waiting at the other end was the man who had never once asked me to be anything but myself. Jesse. He had been there from my first night in the playhouse, guitar case at his side, offering music in place of questions. Over months, his steady presence had grown from comfort to companionship, from companionship to love. He was a man who knew what it was to lose and still create beauty, who would help me sweep dust from the balcony and hang lights over the stage without ever once making me feel like I owed him something in return. As I reached him, the music faded, replaced by a hush that felt warm instead of expectant. We spoke our vows not into microphones but into each other's eyes, promising not perfect days, but days we would choose to share even when they were imperfect. Somewhere near the back, my mother sat beside my stepfather. She wasn't the woman from that garden 10 months ago, the one who had stood silent while my cousin dismantled my life. She had apologized haltingly, imperfectly. And though the wound was still there, it had healed enough for her to be here now. When I caught her watching me, she gave a small, almost shy smile and nodded once, as if to say she understood why I had chosen this life and this man. When Jesse and I kissed, the applause that followed filled the playhouse to its rafters. We danced under the chandelier, its crystal drops scattering light like pieces of a brighter future, the music spilling out into the street. Later, when the last guest had gone, and the night air drifted in through the open doors, I stood with Jesse in the center of the stage, our hands intertwined. This was the place I had come to, with nothing but a key and the remains of my pride. It was the place where I had built something whole. And now it was the place where my next chapter began, not in escape, but in love.